I feel with every generation there's going to be an existential crisis. It just so happens that climate change is ours. And of course it seems so total because it literally encompasses the entire world, the entire earth. But that's the challenge and the opportunity for even greater collaboration and collective action. So what I've just done, we had some cold coffee from earlier this afternoon, and I've put the remnants of it in the fridge, and I'm going to have an iced latte tomorrow morning with the leftover of the coffee. And what I'm going to do with the coffee grinds, normally we would put those out onto the plants on the balcony, but what I'm actually going to do is reserve some in a little dish like this. I'm going to pop them into a little dish, and I'm going to add simply some coconut oil that I have on hand, and later tonight I'm going to give myself a little foot scrub.
Sustainable recipes with Paula.
So my name's Paula Hanasz. I'm a recovering academic. I currently work for the state government in environmental governance. I also have a PhD in transboundary water governance. I was looking at the Ganges and the Brahmaputra basins in South Asia, and I'm particularly interested in the effects of climate change on society, economy, and politics. So my research and policy interests very much lie on that interface between the environment and the human world, which I actually very much see as one and the same rather than two separate spheres, but my professional interests lie more in assessing and preventing the negative consequences of climate change on human society and the world. So I'm currently working on a project on environmental peace building in the Pacific region. I'm looking at things such as overfishing, the collective action problem actually of creating sustainable fishing regimes and enforcement regimes in the region. One of the case studies is actually about the displacement of populations within Fiji due to increasing frequency and intensity of natural disasters, hurricanes, sea level rise, which impacts on availability of fresh water and livelihoods, and again, sort of human displacement. I'm looking at the island of Bougainville and the copper mine that is sort of funded by Australian interest, and the natural resource exploitation there having a profound and rapid sort of impact on traditional social political power structures that have led to violent conflict in which Australia was then sort of involved in terms of creating some stabilisation operations. And this is something that I feel we will be seeing more of in the globe, where, for example, the Rohingya refugee crisis impacting Bangladesh is not just a sort of human security issue and a tragedy and a human rights issue as well, but it's very much an environmental crisis for Bangladesh, particularly the Bundaban district, the Hills district of Bangladesh, which is taking the brunt of this mass influx of people for which the region is not prepared. And you have obviously sort of, human health, sanitation issues, but also the pressure that is putting on fresh water and food, and the environmental degradation is going to have a lasting impact on that part of Bangladesh long after the refugee or the asylum seekers have moved on. Well, I think to answer your question of how we got here into this sort of point of environmental crisis, really, I'm going to go back to your use of the word war. And I think the reason that it's appealing and in some ways appropriate, though in other ways not, is because it is so dramatic. It really conveys a sense of urgency, of something having to be done, and also of a fight, something being wrong that needs to be rectified perhaps by force because other avenues have failed. So I think the reason that climate change is this issue that has emerged in sort of my generation, but in sort of recent decades particularly, is because it's not immediately dramatic. It is a slow burn issue. It is a tragedy of the commons, really, to which we all contribute little bit by little bit, but it's not seen as a dramatic tragedy as other things that preoccupy us. For example, terrorism may seem particularly frightening because the consequences seem so, visual, so immediate, so unexpected. But when the tragedy evolves over decades and generations, then that sense of urgency isn't conveyed to us. And this is, I think, the very essence of human nature to ignore those slow burn problems. And I think we do this all the time in our personal lives as well. So I think that is partly how we as society, as the world, have gotten to this point of neglecting the environment for the sake of our sort of more daily and more immediate convenience. So the convenience of having, fossil fuel powered vehicles, the convenience of having single-use plastics, the convenience of flushing our toilets with drinking water. All of those things have brought great benefits to our society and economy in the short term, with the, I think, very much unintended long-term consequences, which we are now in the position of having to clean up and reverse and course correct in that way. I am using a hemp yarn to make a dish scrubby. It is part of some craft that I do along with my local CWA, that's Country Women's Association, and we put together these eco bags of reusable, sustainable items that can be used in the kitchen. So there's the scrubbies, there's paper rubbish bags, there's beeswax wraps, and there's a few other items that we each make and sell at local charity events. Here is a little stegosaurus. I've made a little sort of other toys for my daughter, as well as these slippers that are keeping my feet warm right now. So this is just a fun, creative way of making things for myself, my family, and friends that I don't have to buy.
So it's good if it's the end of the world tomorrow and you're self-sustainable. You can make your own shoes.
I can make my own shoes. I can make my own clothing and beanies for the winter and blankets and whatnot. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very useful skill. So in recent years, recent decades, we've definitely seen the effects of climate change being compounded.
Yep.
So, as you've mentioned, increasing frequency and increasing intensity of natural disasters, increasing depletion of natural resources. And I guess what we're probably in violent agreement here about is not just that these phenomena happen in nature, in the environment, but they're also compounded, the effects of those environmental effects are compounded by the fact that the world's population of humans is also increasing at quite a rapid rate. And also, the increase of the human population also means an increase in consumption, which then contributes further and exacerbates further human effects on climate change, resource depletion, etc. So it's very much this vicious cycle, self-perpetuating cycle. Having said that, I think we can use that dynamic to reverse and turn into a virtuous cycle as well by changing our behaviour at every level, sort of at the domestic, individual consumption level, at the local, in industry, in government, national and international level. I think so far so little has been done to address the effects of climate change, partly because it is such a slow burn problem with so many different manifestations at different levels over different timescales. At the same time, it is such an overwhelming problem that when faced with something so intangible and monolithic, people feel powerless. And when people feel powerless, they are powerless. So I think that's one of the reasons that so little has been done to address the effects of climate change. I personally also think that, climate change denial has a role to play in this, but at the same time, the language that we use isn't necessarily conducive to obvious, tangible solutions. So when we talk about climate change, what do we mean? There are so many different effects of climate change, which is why I prefer to use that catch-all term, the effects of climate change. So are we talking about sea level rise? Are we talking about temperature, global warming, essentially, which then has effects on, climate patterns and distributions of, rainfall, and that has effects on natural disasters, the frequency and the intensity of natural disasters. Are we talking about the consumption of natural resources, including water? Are we talking about pollution? These are all effects of climate change that, once broken down to their sort of constituent parts, begin to lend themselves more to avenues for addressing those problems. So I think once we start focusing on more concrete aspects of climate change, those in and of themselves may become slightly easier, more manageable to address in concrete ways. When we're talking about domestic consumption and lifestyle choices that have bearing on, our waste habits, consumption habits, the emotional labour that goes into making those decisions about lifestyle still largely falls on women. So there is this other
absolutely.
nexus of, I guess, the ethics of leading sustainable, ethical lives. There are many other considerations because when you're, for example, focusing on reducing nappies or feminine hygiene products going to landfill, those are decisions that largely fall on women to make in the domestic sphere. And at an individual level, those decisions have to be weighed up against other time constraints. Simply the convenience aspects that, it's a trade-off at an individual level. So the time that I personally am not spending in washing cloth nappies, I am spending in working in environmental governance. Well, in our urban realm, I think there is a slow and quiet shift towards thinking beyond nature in the city and beginning to think in terms of the city in nature. So using green infrastructure as a deliberate planning strategy and thinking of trees and other sort of green vines and plants and herbs as part of the urban landscape and as infrastructure assets to be valued and taken care of and invested in the same way as we invest in the built infrastructure. And I definitely see that through some of my work for the state government, a shift towards that. But it will also require a shift in attitudes from the general population. In Australia, we simply cannot continue living on our quarter-acre blocks and having this ideal of, the big backyard, which you apparently need if you're going to have children. I think that's, in terms of my personal lifestyle, that's not the lifestyle that I have chosen for myself, but also in more sort of macro scale, we are, as a society, going to have to move towards more sort of dense urban dwellings, sort of medium density housing, and our governments are going to have to continue investing in that as part of a affordable housing sort of offering as well, but for the sake of the environment, and it's also easier to provide other social services such as public transport in slightly denser urban environments as well. And when we begin to think of our society and our economy as an ecosystem, much in the way that we are beginning to understand or reframe the way that we think about nature as an integrated ecosystem where changes in one part have consequences for the other. When we begin to understand our society, our economy, our politics as an integrated ecosystem, then we can begin to think of where our levers of influence and pressure can be applied to best affect outcomes elsewhere in the system. Properties are cheaper in floodplains, for example. And then they're also more expensive to insure there. And that's where we get the really human tragedy aspects of the effects of climate change, particularly the increasing frequency and extremity of natural disasters, particularly flood events. It is the people who are least able to cope with that who are the most profoundly affected, because they may not be able to either afford to live elsewhere, to afford the insurance for the reparations and the reconstruction. And again, obviously, more broadly, in the rest of the world, we see that as well. So in terms of how do we create political will, well, again, this is the frustrating and the beautiful thing about democracy. It really does reflect, to my mind, the majority, the views of the majority of the citizens. So if you are genuinely concerned with climate change or any other social justice issue, then yes, you can gripe about it on Facebook, like a few posts, or you could channel that energy and time into actually campaigning your local member of parliament, letting them know what is important to you and why they should act in your stated interest.
In your experience, do you feel like you and your partner and your family at large are a rarity? Or is it you see that happening around you a lot?
In this neighbourhood, we are not that rare in terms of our sort of environmental consciousness, but I do feel that we in particular have a maybe slightly higher understanding of the water consumption. I feel that sort of peers and neighbours are increasingly good at making sort of responsible and conscious choices about plastics consumption and waste. But again, that understanding of water consumption, of embedded water, virtual water, is still not quite up to that same level. So I feel in terms of our water consumption, maybe we're just a little bit ahead of the curve, but hopefully soon society will exceed our own sort of efforts. The water, the H2O that we can see and drink, that is only part of the water consumption that we are contributing to. The other thing that I feel we need to start as a society being more aware of is all the embedded water in all the food that we consume. So we already have an understanding, partly through corporate initiatives, of our carbon footprints. So I feel as a society we are generally fairly literate in terms of what can contribute to our carbon footprint, but we have not yet begun to understand our water footprint, which is comprised not only of the water that we drink, that we flush down our toilets, that we use in our very long showers, but that is also embedded particularly in the meat that we consume, in all the almonds for our almond milk, in our turmeric, soy, kale lattes. So I feel the next awakening really needs to be about water footprint. Really, the point about water is that it has multiple uses and therefore multiple values. So the food, energy, water nexus is really the crux of the problem, because when we begin to run out of water, we begin to run out of food. And that is something I feel in Australia we are completely missing in the debates around water governance, and when we particularly talk about this false dichotomy of environmental flows versus the rights and benefits of Australian farmers, we forget that those interests are not and should not be pitted against each other, but rather they are very much the same interest. I think as a society we've very quickly become very good about thinking of reducing our disposable cup consumption, because we've begun to fetishise the reusable cups, which is great, although when you begin to think about the embedded energy and the water that goes into producing either the glass or the plastic, then that only becomes a net good over thousands and thousands of uses of that cup. So getting a new one every couple of months may actually not quite have the same positive effect as we sort of imagine when we sort of feel good, warm and fuzzy for buying a reusable cup. But really, if we wanted to have an actual positive impact, we'd do away with our coffee entirely because of, you know, all the water and the carbon miles that sort of go into bringing us our overpriced but delicious, you know, coffee every day. Again, I'm clearly, you know,
biased, but
but I think sort of thinking more about the food that we consume, obviously where it comes from, how it has been produced is part of the story. But look, as individuals, we don't all have to become vegan. I would suggest, however, that we all have a long, hard think about what it would take for us to go part of the way towards being vegan. For me, I'm not giving up cheese. That's a hard no for me. I know that's my limit. But beef, I can live without it. So I'm advocating for more conscious consumption choices, particularly in terms of our food and water consumption. I'm advocating for a reduction in the consumption of meat. If I had a magic wand, I would make all airline food plant-based by default, and if you particularly wanted dead animal on your flight, then you would have to tick a little box sort of saying that's the meal that you would like, rather than having meat as the default, and for vegetarians and vegans and other sort of dietary requirements to opt out of that. Likewise, you know, menus in cafes, ideally with my magic wand, I would like to serve as default all sort of plant-based vegetarian options with meat as the added extra, to make people sort of think a bit more consciously about, or mindfully about, what does that meat mean to them. But you can do no right, you know, if you want to move away from drinking cow's milk and want to shift towards more environmentally sustainable sources of a milk-like substance, well, soy is possible, sort of problematic in other ways. Almonds have a huge water footprint, and, you know, and the bulk of the world's almond supply comes from California. So you then have to think about, well, the carbon miles that are that entails, but also the ethics of purchasing such a product that has such a high embedded water content from a place that may be going through drought. So there is no one solution to this. It is incredibly complex, and we are never going to live perfect ethical lives. What's the solution? Talking to each other, having a long, hard think about what is more important. For example, you know, for me, that as a water security and water governance expert, the water footprint's particularly important to me. But then, you know, buying something that's been locally produced, or maybe that's been you know, the human labour that has gone into the production and the distribution and packaging of that product, to me, as far as I'm aware, should also be, you know, ethical. You know, ethical labour practices are important to me as well. But then I'm also middle class and educated, and I've got the privilege of being able to ask these questions, to shop at places that I know are fair trade or organic, and that's not for everybody. So ultimately there's only so far that our individual choices will go. There have to be these system-wide changes. Look, the other thing that we do for our child is buying only secondhand clothes and toys. Basically, all of the toys that you can see here are either secondhand or they have been given to us as gifts, and they will certainly be put back into that virtuous cycle of items of children's clothing and toys. Here is my daughter's favourite book at the moment, which I also found at an op shop. It's The Waterhole by Graham Base, which for me as a water governance specialist just warms my heart. It's basically just a very beautifully illustrated book about what happens when there's no more water. And again, I think partly, again, in terms of the individual consumption and lifestyle and behaviour, it's going to have to be tied in with creating status in society around living frugally. So that's why I think the popularity of the reusable cups is positive, overall positive, because whilst I think for many people it's a fashion accessory to a large extent, ultimately it does make people think about the effects of their daily actions on the broader world. Yeah, particularly in terms of consumption and waste. I think the parallels with tobacco companies are just very clear, where again the science was obvious, the massively negative consequences of the industry were obvious, but as long as there could be a profit made, the profit will be made. And I think that the same thing is definitely happening with fossil fuel and other sort of extractive industries. But this is where we sort of come down to providing incentives for industry, for investing in renewable energy sources. And I think partly that must come from government, from governing incentives and investments, but also pressure from consumers. I mean, in the Western world as well. Having said that, not to sound like an apologist for industry, I also think sometimes the most interesting and beneficial initiatives can actually come from within the industry, which can sometimes actually be a lot more agile than government and policy. And it can be in the interest of particular companies or industries to actually protect the environment. So I'm very specifically thinking of, for example, the world's largest soft drink producer, which may have factories in developing countries, but requires clean water. And so it's in the interest of that company to, for example, invest in good water stewardship. Likewise, I think all the sort of fast fashion, coming back to your earlier question about what is the most sort of pressing issue, I think fast fashion is also a massive problem.
Actually, I don't know.
What is fast fashion? How are you asking me this? All right.
Sorry,
Well,
I'm old. What is fast?
Where was your shirt made?
The shirt, probably China. But
Probably China. How was it made?
Yeah.
When are you going to throw it away and get a new one?
Well, hopefully Not soon.
Hopefully not soon, right. But when you've got, these clothing companies that sell, have new collections no longer every season, but perhaps every month, it sort of perpetuates this impetus to consume, to buy. And of course, the quality of the garments is such that they fall apart quickly. So there's also the demand for the latest fashions and styles, but also the practicality of clothes quickly falling apart, combined with sort of loss of mending skills. Who knows how to sew on a button anymore? Or who would, darn a sock these days when you can just go out and buy a new pair? And these are, of course, produced primarily in countries such as Bangladesh, China, in generally, though not exclusively, appalling sort of working conditions. And then even if those working conditions are ethical, then we've got to think about, what is the environmental impact of the dyes that have gone into the fabrics that we are consuming? And then also, as we begin to shift towards greater demand for, natural fabrics, what is the effect of that on cotton growing, which is a massively, water-intensive crop, basically. So again, here is the complex trade-offs that we as individuals cannot possibly hold in our brains at the same time, especially when we have, say, a very quickly growing toddler who does need a shirt for 3 months and then will grow out of it if it hasn't been torn or stained through wear and tear in the meantime. So that's fast fashion. So I think that is actually another part of the immediate problem. But again, slowly, there are very practical things that we as consumers can do to begin sending signals to the market about that. Am I locking you in?
Yeah.
I love the hat, So I went away to a tree planting on the weekend. Sorry, not this weekend, last weekend. And was having a conversation about how I use newspaper for poop scooping for the dog.
Excellent. Another way in which dogs leave less of an environmental impact than babies?
My dog, maybe. I don't see anyone else doing it, and it is fraught.
It is fraught. Look, I think the deterioration of public trust in government, institutions, and authority generally is a not new phenomenon, but a particularly worrying one, not just in terms of environmental governance, but also social, political, economic stability. I think it is definitely troubling to see lack of engagement with democratic processes. Having said that, I think society and governance structures have always tended to get more and more complex and will only continue to get more and more complex, which means there is in some ways a diffusion of authority and power that is novel in this phase of shifting, in this phase of change, but may ultimately create newer power structures and opportunities for addressing pressing issues at a more appropriate level.
So how are we now so far along that we're in a climate emergency and...
We've known this all along.
We've known
this since the Silent Spring. But you also can't stress too much about it because everything we do is wrong. Just our very existence has such an impact on the planet that, in complex, unintended ways that maybe positive in one aspect and then negative in another, that I don't think we can possibly stress too much.
Well, that's actually where I was going before when I was saying about using the newspaper.
Yeah.
Bin liners and things like that, and to wash the windows. Like,
Yeah.
I cannot get windows clean with a squeegee. I can get them clean with wet newspaper and then dry newspaper. And it's awesome, and I love it. And I must
The disintegration of like print journalism is a real threat to the cleanliness of our windows. So I think the power structures are definitely shifting, sometimes for the worse, which is why we're sort of seeing these sort of unexpected rises in populism around the world, which to me is a sign of people's overall discontent with the status quo. And fear. And just a itching for change, which can be harnessed for more positive, in my in what I conceive of as a sort of a positive ideology. But I definitely think there's increasingly novel ways of making human connections across the world on issues of mutual importance. And that's why I actually think in times of political uncertainty, it's all the more important to engage with the political process. And like I say, if you feel dissatisfied or disempowered by the politicians that you currently have, well, the system already exists for you to make the changes, be that in terms of voting for someone who more aligns with your values, if that candidate is available. If not, then campaigning your existing local member to raise the profile of the issues which are of concern, or yourself running for local council or other levels of government. We sort of forget that is open to any old fish and chip shop owner from Queensland. I mean, there's always going to be a rise and fall and a action and reaction, and in that sense, I sort of feel some of these populist movements are actually forcing a reconsideration of what is actually important and what do we want to see, and it's sort of motivating action, political action that can also be positive.
All of the responsibility is on the
us as individuals. And that's bullshit.
Sort your recycling properly, not put it in a plastic bag, not use a plastic bag, not. At the same time as we're being told to buy, consume, and therefore you must also be buying, new things regularly. All the plastics you have to keep replacing. Yep. So on one hand, we're being told to consume. On the other hand, then the onus of responsibility is placed back on us. Yeah, so, I go to incredible lengths. I now shop at 10 shops instead of 2,
right?
Yeah. So I go to the dairy for the milk, and I go to Meatsmith because they wrap it in paper.
Exactly, yeah.
I'm a tiny little bit concerned about the glossiness of the paper. I'm not sure. I have to look more into it. And actually, their reusable bags had just arrived when I was there, and they were unpacking them. And of course, they each individually come
wrapped in plastic.
So even if you're buying a new shirt, right, at a shop that isn't locally made, that has arrived in plastic, in a box, in plastic. It's the whole chain is broken, and then as the consumer, you're the one who's got to make all these decisions. And shopping at 10 stores is not a problem for me. I don't have kids, but it takes 6 hours on a Saturday. Right. And I love it because it's all sort of, local things, but it's still effort.
The effects of climate change are very much a threat multiplier in terms of other existing social, ethnic conflicts and instability and outright violence as well. So it's not necessarily that, say, drought in Syria caused the Arab Spring, but the confluence of environmental factors such as drought combined with decades of agricultural mismanagement combined with corrupt governance and the perceptions of inequitable distribution of environmental resources and food insecurity all combine to exacerbate other social and political tensions that ultimately came to a head in a sort of perfect storm of instability. And that's why we can't simply say climate change causes human displacement. It's not that linear. It's why, for example, California can go through a massive prolonged drought, but not, break out in civil war, basically, because there are other mitigating factors on that. So, sort of strong government, rule of law, strong economy, etc., where that creates the resilience that can absorb some of the shocks of the effects of climate change. Same in Australia, for example. So it's not as simple as saying that environmental scarcity or degradation or the effects of climate change will cause conflict, but it is yet another factor to consider in increasingly complex sociopolitical situations.
So why do you come here, Paula?
I come here to satisfy my child's insatiable need for sultanas, which she consumes ungodly amounts of.
And what's special about the sauce then?
Well,
this place?
I really like the convenience of it. I'm super close to where I live. I love that I can bring my own containers or put things in paper rather than everything coming wrapped in plastic. But most importantly, I like that I can buy as much or as little as I need. Yeah, it's crazy to be buying these sort of snacks in plastic or foil. And to be honest, a lot of this stuff is actually better value.
So
Especially,
is this the way of the future? I mean, like,
absolutely.
we just walk past the Coles.
We did just walk past the Coles, straight past
Should be
it.
like this? Should it be like this everywhere? I mean,
Ideally, yeah. To reduce the packaging in particular, but also to allow people to buy as much or as little as they need. And I think that helps people think more about fulfilling their needs rather than their greed, and reduces waste as well. And I think that's really important. And yeah, I love that I can bring my own containers here. I also not just buy sultanas, but also all of our liquid soap, dishwashing detergent, laundry detergent, spices. It's interesting thinking about the likelihood that my daughter probably won't need to learn to drive. She will probably have autonomous vehicles, and in my sort of socialist utopia mindset, I'm assuming will be a form of public transport not monopolised by a capitalist elite. So it's sort of interesting to think that perhaps she won't need to learn to drive, and cars that burn and aeroplanes that burn fossil fuels may be a relic of the past. That's really interesting. I think she will not blink an eye about the fact that all the water that she drinks will probably be recycled. I think she will not think about the fact that most of the food that she consumes is plant-based, locally, maybe even hyper-locally produced, probably using a lot more fertiliser that's a byproduct of human waste. I think that sort of moving towards more like a closed loop sort of system of food production and water recycling will just be the norm in her lifetime. I don't have the emotional energy to fear for her future. I would rather channel my emotional energy into the now and what's within my physical capacity and within my capabilities to affect today, because the future has always been unpredictable. That's, I think, a defining characteristic of the future. But I trust that we as her parents will instill in her good values, a sense of civic duty, which I think we as a society have lost, and I think is very important, not just in terms of the political sphere, but very much in terms of the environmental governance or the custodianship of the natural environment. And my partner and I very consciously make our lifestyle choices based on our strong sense of civic duty. And I hope that we instill that in our daughter. In fact, when she was born, we took her home on the bus because we don't have a car. So I don't fear too much because I think that's a waste of my emotional energies, and I trust that she will make ethical decisions and lead a productive life that benefits the society and the planet that we leave to her. And there's also Mars. I'm sure she'll be able to just migrate to Mars when this planet's no longer viable. The thing that humanity is best at is bringing ourselves to the brink of self-imposed apocalypse and bringing ourselves back at the 11th hour. I think with every generation there has been an existential crisis, and it is the fear of what world we are leaving for our children that makes us course correct just at that very last moment.